with the shaping of my emerging view of effectiveness, I begin to see a direction for civil rights and the issue of race that is significant for African Americans and others with rights denied. To assist me, I use my thinking from my point of view. Thinking from my view of effectiveness, I start with a focus on the underlying problem, issue, and its history in our country, and that is inhuman treatment in the form of human slavery and bondage. Thinking from my view of effectiveness, I reach an important beginning perspective for a view of slavery and bondage in our nation. It is with regard to human capacity for inhuman treatment. All human beings have the capacity for effective or human treatment. All human beings have the capacity for ineffective or inhuman treatment. As we look through history, we have examples. There have been white slave holders of white slaves, white slave holders of black slaves, black slave holders of black slaves, black slave holders of white slaves, slave holders in one culture of slaves within the same culture, slave holders of one culture of slaves within another culture. Thinking from my view of effectiveness, I review the problem, the issue of enslavement in the setting of New World America. The emerging nation was involved in the issue, problem of slavery of blacks. This problem was significantly influenced by the factor of economic development and economic exploitation. From a base of activism came forth the movement for abolition to address the problem of slavery and the profound influence of economic exploitation. For the emerging nation, the problems, issues, moved to a stage of emancipation of slaves and the reconstruction of the South after the Civil War. These problems were influenced by factors such as ongoing economic exploitation, the denial of rights for African Americans, uncovering underlying, expanding bigotry. These problems, issues, and their related influences were the focus of an activism for advocacy for the rights and protections for African Americans. For the emerging nation, the problems, issues were solidifying temporarily in a posture of separate but equal treatment for African Americans, supported by the continuing and expanding influence of factors such as economic exploitation, economic competition, bigotry, and classism. Activism continued with initiative to ensure equal rights and protections. For the growing nation, the problems, issues of separate but equal treatment for African Americans and the related influences were profoundly impacted by the emerging significant activism of the Black Civil Rights Movement, shifting the problems and issues from separate but equal treatment to the issue of access to equal rights and opportunities. The influences on the problems and issues persisted in the form of, for example, exploitation, competition, racism, bigotry, and classism. Within the growing nation, activism advanced with the expanded initiative of the Black Civil Rights Movement and evolving, increasing political leadership impacted problems and issues, moving toward equal rights and opportunity gains. Factors such as exploitation, competition, racism, bigotry, classism continued to influence the problems and issues. Within our growing nation, problems, issues persist with not only equal rights and opportunity gains, but also equal rights and opportunity losses. This is coupled with a growing recognition of the problem of income inequality. Activism has begun to struggle with the strategy of continuing civil rights best practices in the context of rapidly changing and complex circumstances. Additionally, there has been an effort to increase diversity awareness in our country. The problems of equal rights and opportunity gains and losses are driven by the ongoing force of influences such as exploitation, competition, racism, bigotry, and classism. Thinking from my view of effectiveness with relation to our nation's history, from African American enslavement to the struggle for equal rights and opportunity, with related activism and influences, the definition of freedom takes on great significance as we look at the challenge of facing these problems and issues. I remind myself that freedom includes not only the absence of constraints in areas such as equal rights and opportunities, but it also includes the freedom to think, a capacity possessed by each and every one of us. My recognition of and use of this freedom to think is critical in working with effectiveness to build a direction for civil rights and the related problems and issues. Building from my base of effectiveness and my freedom to think, I view the problems, issues for African Americans and the related activism and the related influences on these problems and issues. I am able to uncover the element of effectiveness that is hidden beneath the problems and issues faced by African Americans. This brings into clarity, on the one hand, the problems, issues for African Americans with the related influences and initiatives for activism. On the other hand, we have the underlying factor of effectiveness. Thinking from my point of view of effectiveness, I recognize the simple but important relationship between problems and issues in any setting on the one hand and effectiveness on the other hand. Thinking from my view of effectiveness, I identify an important association between problems, issues, and effectiveness. In research terms, it's an hypothesis, a guess with regard to a correlation. In this instance, an inverse correlation. At high or rising levels of effectiveness, there is a greater likelihood of low or dropping levels of problems, issues. Also, at high or rising levels of effectiveness, there is a greater likelihood that, to varying degrees, all people benefit. On the other hand, with this association, at low or dropping levels of effectiveness, there is a greater likelihood of high or rising levels of problems, issues. At low levels of effectiveness, to varying degrees, all people are at risk. Thinking from my view of effectiveness, I see a relationship between levels of effectiveness on the one hand and levels of problems, issues on the other. With this perspective, I revisit U.S. history, and I see that along with extraordinary and unparalleled growth, a relationship between, on the one hand, high levels of problems, issues, including slavery, emancipation, separate but equal treatment, a struggle for equal rights and opportunities, and, on the other hand, significant elements of low or declining levels of human effectiveness, including an economy based on the institution of slavery, not just in the South, but in the North, a failure of Reconstruction after the Civil War, the growth of business monopolies and consolidations moving to control the emerging economy of the new nation, labor rights and working condition issues, economic depression. Thinking from my view of effectiveness and reviewing this relationship between low levels of human effectiveness on the one hand and problems or issues on the other hand, I also see an important association between low levels of human effectiveness on the one hand and the rise of the influence of elements or factors on the problems or issues that are being addressed. At low levels of human effectiveness, there is not only an association with high levels of problems, issues, but also a void or empty space is created within which the influences grow and gain strength. This vacuum provides a haven for influences such as racism, bigotry, and classism that together flourish and expand to contribute to the formation and the existence of the beast, which extends its destructive effect on efforts to resolve problems and issues. As activists address problems and issues related to freedom and opportunity, they must understand the relationship between levels of effectiveness and levels of problems and issues. With this view, they can and must recognize the enemies with which they contend. There are two. The first enemy is the beast or dragon of racism, bigotry, classism, or other influences. It is against this enemy that activists have fought from the times of abolition through to the times of the civil rights movement. The real enemy, the second enemy, provides the haven and nourishment for the beast. This real enemy is ineffectiveness. With activists recognizing they are facing two enemies, the first, the beast, the second, the real enemy, low levels of human effectiveness, they can see the relationship between levels of effectiveness and impact on the void or the haven that houses the beast. As activists address the first enemy head on, they must also take the initiative to increase levels of human effectiveness. With this, they shrink the void, the space for the existence of the beast. Activists will never eliminate the beast. Activists can reduce its opportunity to influence problems and issues. Thinking from my view of effectiveness, African Americans and others with rights denied must come to see the full definition of freedom. It includes the absence of constraints, access to rights, opportunities, but also, most importantly, it includes the freedom to think. African Americans and others with rights denied must recognize their capacity to think and exercise this freedom to think. It is with the capacity to think that African Americans and others with rights denied can address the relationship between levels of effectiveness on the one hand and levels of problems or issues on the other hand to fulfill freedom and opportunity. For African Americans and others with rights denied, overlooking their freedom to think, to acknowledge the relationship between levels of effectiveness on the one hand and levels of problems and issues on the other will lead them to a loss of initiative. They will define themselves only in reaction to and experience a history of discrimination and unfair treatment. They will be at a loss in terms of identifying their individuality. They'll be at a loss in terms of thinking for themselves and finding a mind of their own. They will experience themselves as trapped and paralyzed in a quest for entitlement.